pit did not announce itself. When federal surveyors pushed into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the 1840s, they were looking for copper deposits their maps had already marked as untouched, unworked, waiting. What the ground gave them instead was evidence that someone had been there before them, not recently, not casually, but in numbers and with a discipline that the geological record could not dismiss, and the institutional framework of 1845 was not built to accommodate. Ancient pits, some reaching 60 feet into the bedrock, cut with deliberate geometry. Drainage channels carved into the walls to prevent flooding in shafts sunk deep enough that water became a constant threat. Stone hammers, shaped granite tools weighing up to 30 pounds, left at the work sites in quantities implying not a handful of people testing the stone, but a sustained labor force operating across an organized extraction system. The copper beneath the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale is native copper, pure metallic copper occurring in the rock in metallic form, without the chemical bonding that normally locks copper in ore and requires smelting to release. It does not need to be refined. It needs only to be broken free and carried out. And someone had been breaking it free and carrying it out, systematically, across what the radiocarbon record would eventually reveal to be a span of more than 2,000 years, before a single European surveyor arrived to announce the discovery of what had already been found and worked and partially exhausted long before he got there. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Federal geologist Charles Whittlesey surveyed the ancient workings across the Keweenaw and the surrounding region and published his findings in 1863. The document is not obscure. It was a formal federal geological publication. His estimate for the total copper removed from the Lake Superior deposits by the ancient miners fell between 1.5 billion and 2 billion pounds. Those figures did not come from speculation. They came from the physical dimensions of documented pit systems, from the volumes of displaced rock and tailings surrounding the workings, from the measurable geometry of an extraction operation cut into the ground over generations and preserved well enough that a systematic survey could reconstruct its scale. Radiocarbon dating conducted on preserved wood recovered from the ancient shaft supports, timbers sitting in waterlogged ground for millennia before the survey teams reached them, produced dates ranging from 3,000 to 5,500 years before the present. The most intensive period of extraction, the period when the evidence of activity is densest and most sustained, runs from roughly 3000 BCE to 1000 BCE. That is a 2,000-year window. No individual culture whose presence in the Lake Superior region is documented by North American archaeology accounts for an extraction volume anywhere near what that survey recorded. The copper that left those pits went somewhere. Where it went, and who moved it and why the institutional record that came after the survey chose not to press the question, is what the evidence still holds waiting to be asked. The Hopewell culture, the civilization that flourished across the eastern United States from roughly 200 BCE to 500 CE, is the first culture for which the movement of Lake Superior copper is archaeologically documented with quantitative precision. Mass spectrometry analysis conducted between 2015 and 2017 on 52 copper objects excavated from 6 Hopewell burial sites in the Scioto Valley of southern Ohio confirmed the origin of the metal. The copper in those objects came primarily from Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula, more than 750 miles from where the objects were deposited in burial mounds. A single cache recovered from one Hopewell mound site held 120 individual copper pieces. A copper celt, an axe-like tool, recovered from an Ohio mound weighed 38 pounds. Another copper object from Illinois weighed more than 5 pounds. These were not ornamental traces of incidental contact or the products of a slow drift of small objects through generations of casual exchange. They were heavy, carefully worked objects produced in volume, transported across vast distances through a system organized enough to sustain itself for centuries across terrain that had no roads, no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals capable of hauling loads across that scale of distance. The river systems of North America made that movement possible in ways that are easy to underestimate from a modern perspective. when roads and railways and shipping containers have caused the waterways to recede into scenic background. The Mississippi connects the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes Basin. The Ohio connects the Mississippi to the Appalachian foothills. The Illinois, the Wabash, the Maumee, and dozens of smaller tributaries thread the entire interior of the continent into a continuous navigable network that a vessel designed for river travel could use to reach from the shores of Lake Superior to the ceremonial centers of the Scioto Valley in southern Ohio, with only short overland portages between connected river systems. The total route runs approximately 800 miles. In a system with established staging areas, recognized protocols, and communities positioned along the route to support the movement of goods, that distance was traversable and was in fact traversed, repeatedly, for centuries. The Hopewell moved copper south and east along those waterways, while shells from the Gulf of Mexico moved north and inland. Obsidian from the volcanic fields of Wyoming appeared in Ohio burial mounds without leaving any artifact trail across the 2,000 miles of intervening terrain, and mica from the southern Appalachians turned up in mounds distributed across the Midwest. Ohio archaeologist Brad Lepper pointed out that the obsidian's presence at Ohio sites without intermediate deposits cannot be explained by ordinary village-to-village exchange of the kind where each community passes material along to the next. If it had moved that way, the route would show in the artifact record. The route does not show. Directed, organized long-distance movement is the only mechanism the distribution supports, and that kind of organization does not sustain itself across centuries without a civilization behind it. The name researchers gave this system, the Hopewell Interaction Sphere, is deliberately cautious. The term avoids the word trade because the mechanisms by which materials moved across these distances are not fully understood, and the word carries commercial implications that may not capture the ceremonial and political dimensions of what was happening. What the term describes is a set of populations spread across the eastern United States, connected not by shared language or political structure, but by a common ceremonial tradition and a material relationship that moved specific exotic substances across a geographic range that challenges any simple accounting. Grizzly bear teeth from the Rocky Mountains appeared in Ohio mounds. Shark teeth from the Atlantic coast showed up at inland sites more than 1,000 miles from the ocean. Silver from Ontario, freshwater pearls from rivers distributed across the continent, copper from a peninsula in Michigan. Each of these materials traveled distances that should have been prohibitive for the period, and yet the archaeological record contains them, repeatedly, at Hopewell sites spread across a territory larger than most of the empires the ancient world produced. The Hopewell were operating at a continental scale. The institutional account has consistently underestimated what that scale required and what it implies. The Hopewell were not the beginning. The Lake Superior mines predate the Hopewell by more than 2,000 years. The extraction operation that Whittlesey measured was already well underway when the people who would eventually develop into the Hopewell cultural tradition were not yet a recognizable archaeological presence anywhere in the eastern United States. And when the Hopewell period closed around 500 CE, the copper trade did not simply end. The Mississippian cultures that followed the Hopewell used copper. The archaic cultures that preceded the Hopewell by centuries used copper from the same deposits. Every documented North American culture with access to the Lake Superior trade network drew from those mines across the full span of prehistory covered by the regional archaeological record. All of them together, every gram of copper deposited in every known burial mound, every documented cache, every recovered artifact from every North American site ever formally excavated, represent a fraction of what Whittlesey's survey established had been pulled from the ground. The gap between the documented local use and the total documented extraction is not marginal. It is enormous. The copper went somewhere the North American archaeological record does not account for, and the institutions responsible for assembling that record declined, at the moment when the question was freshest and the evidence most accessible, to ask where. The Ojibwe oral record addresses the question directly, though the institutional bodies that assembled the official consensus chose to receive that record as mythology, rather than as historical testimony deserving the same scrutiny applied to any other primary source. A documentation effort connected to the Wisconsin State Historical Society in 1894 recorded detailed accounts from Ojibwe elders describing a people who had worked the Lake Superior copper deposits before the Ojibwe themselves established dominance in the region. The accounts were specific. They described organized extraction operating at large scale, multiple groups working in coordination across the mining sites. Copper moved to the shoreline systematically and loaded onto vessels for transport. The people described arrived from the east, from across the Great Water, and came specifically for the copper. At some point, the elders said, those people stopped coming. The accounts also described the technical method those miners used. Fire applied directly to the rock face, cold water poured against the heated stone, the thermal shock splitting the rock and exposing the copper seam beneath. The technique is called fire setting. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Fire setting is not something a person discovers by experimenting at the rock face on a particular afternoon. It is a technique that belongs to a tradition of underground mining, developed over generations through practice, passed down deliberately within communities whose extraction operations depended on it. The same technique is documented in the ancient copper mines of the Sinai Peninsula, in the silver mines of Laurion in classical Greece, in the gold mines of pharaonic Egypt. The physical evidence from the Lake Superior mine shafts confirms it was applied there as well. Fire cracked rock in the walls of the ancient pits, ash deposits at the base of the workings, thermal fracture patterns in the stone consistent with deliberate heating, followed by rapid quenching with cold water. The oral testimony recorded in 1894 and the physical archaeology documented in the mine shafts arrived at the same technical conclusion from entirely separate directions of inquiry. The institutional record responded by placing the oral account in the category of indigenous legend and treating the mine shaft evidence as pre-Columbian curiosity, a classification that relieved anyone of the obligation to explain how the same specialized technique appeared at the same historical moment on opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean. The researchers who assembled the dominant narrative of North American prehistory in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were working within a framework of assumptions that the evidence was already placing under strain. The Smithsonian Institution, whose Bureau of Ethnology held the authoritative voice in American archaeology through much of this period, had structural incentives to prefer a simpler account. A simpler account did not require explaining where 2 billion pounds of extracted copper went. It did not require engaging with the possibility that the people who designed and built the Newark Earthworks in Ohio, geometric enclosures covering 4 square miles aligned to the 18-year lunar cycle with an accuracy measurable in fractions of a degree across distances of miles, had organizational and intellectual connections extending beyond the boundaries of the continent. A simpler account preserved the founding narrative of American settlement, and the institutions that had been built in service of that narrative had no structural mechanism for incorporating evidence that complicated it. What the Newark Earthworks actually show, when the survey data is examined on its own terms without the prior assumption that pre-Columbian North America was uniformly a world of isolated village cultures, is a civilization capable of encoding precise astronomical knowledge in permanent monumental architecture, transmitting the technical expertise required to execute that architecture across generations of builders, and sustaining a continental-scale logistics network that moved heavy raw materials from specific distant sources to specific ceremonial destinations, with an organization and consistency that persisted across centuries. The geometry at Newark is not approximate, it is precise. The lunar alignment is not coincidental. The copper caches buried in the Ohio mounds did not accumulate through casual drift. This was a civilization operating at a scale and with a reach the founding narrative was not built to accommodate, and the institutions that set the terms of the debate chose, through selective publication and the subordination of inconvenient field data, what the 20th century would be permitted to know about it. The question the extraction volume forces is whether the ancient copper road ended at the Hopewell burial centers of Ohio, or continued further. The isotopic evidence from the Bronze Age Mediterranean raises the possibility that it continued much further. When researchers applied lead isotope analysis to the copper ingots recovered from the Uluburun shipwreck, a Bronze Age vessel that sank off the Turkish coast around 1300 BCE, carrying 10 tons of copper in the standardized oxhide ingot form used throughout the ancient Mediterranean trade network. A significant portion of the cargo returned isotopic profiles that did not match Cyprus, Sardinia, the Sinai Peninsula, or any other characterized Old World copper source with the confidence a clear attribution requires. The isotopic profile of Lake Superior native copper falls within a range consistent with some of those unattributed samples. Consistent with is not the same as definitively from. The methodology has limitations. The database of characterized copper deposits is not complete. Alternative Old World sources not yet fully characterized may exist. What those results do not do is go away. Multiple independent research teams, working with different samples from the Uluburun cargo and from comparable Bronze Age sites across the Mediterranean, have produced results that consistently resist clean attribution to the identified European and Mediterranean sources. The Bronze Age copper shortfall, the documented gap between the copper demand implied by the combined archaeological record of Egypt, Minoan Crete, Canaan and the Hittite Empire, and the known supply capacity of the Old World deposits, has never been closed. Lake Superior produced copper during exactly the centuries when Bronze Age demand was highest. The Uluburun ship went down around 1300 BCE. The Lake Superior mines were at or near peak production at that precise moment. The fire-setting connection runs between these two bodies of evidence in a way the standard account has not addressed. If the people the Ojibwe elders described, those who arrived from across the Great Water and worked the deposits before departing, carried fire-setting as part of an established mining tradition, they brought a technique that was standard knowledge in the mining cultures of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean. The technique does not appear to have been independently developed at Lake Superior. The physical evidence shows it was used there. The oral record says the people who used it came from somewhere across the water and eventually returned. The ancient Mediterranean contains civilizations with documented maritime reach into the open Atlantic. The Phoenicians, the most sophisticated maritime trading culture of the first millennium BCE, are recorded in ancient sources as instructing their captains to ground their vessels rather than allow foreign ships to follow them to their trading destinations. The routes were assets worth protecting by any means available. The source of the copper those routes served was not a detail to be written down. No surviving document specifies what the Phoenician Western Atlantic voyages were seeking. The surviving records were not designed to specify. But the Bronze Age world ran on copper. The Old World sources were demonstrably insufficient to supply it at documented consumption volumes. The largest known deposit of native copper on Earth was being actively worked during those precise centuries by people using techniques shared with the ancient Mediterranean mining traditions, and the isotopic data from the Uluburun cargo has not been satisfactorily explained by any Old World source the research community has thus far identified. What the continent still holds is the distance between these facts and any account the consensus has been willing to assemble from them. The mine shafts on the Keweenaw Peninsula have not all been excavated. The full isotopic profile of the Lake Superior deposits has not been systematically compared against the full range of unattributed Bronze Age copper from Mediterranean sites. The Ojibwe oral record, preserved in regional archives and in the living memory of communities whose relationship to this land predates any institution that later claimed interpretive authority over it, has not been formally incorporated into the archaeological framework governing how the ancient copper road is understood, taught, or investigated. The pits are still in Michigan, the copper is still in the mounds, the river systems the ancient road traveled are still running to the sea, the ore was there, the technique was there, the demand was there across an ocean. The timing aligns across 3,000 years and 4,000 miles. That is not a closed record, it is an open one, and the continent has not yet given up what it knows about who pulled the copper from the ground, where it traveled, and why the people who came for it stopped coming. The answer, when the evidence is finally assembled without the institutional preference for a simpler story, will not come as a surprise to the Ojibwe elders whose testimony was collected in 1894 and then placed in an archive category that excused the mainstream record from engaging with it. They said people came from across the Great Water, worked the copper, and left. They said it with the specificity of communities whose oral traditions carry precise knowledge across long spans of time. The fire-cracked walls of the ancient pits said the same thing in a different register. The isotopic profiles from the Uluburun cargo said it in the language of geochemistry. 3 witnesses from 3 different directions of evidence, pointing toward the same conclusion, and the official account has spent a century and a half finding reasons to look somewhere else. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.